All right, you guys asked for it. Israel. Let's talk about them. Now, Israel, one of the most militarily advanced states in the world, special thanks to the United States, has been repeatedly accused of committing war crimes over the past several decades. Massacres, indiscriminate bombings, targeted killings, forced displacement, and policies that international law experts call crimes against humanity. This isn't anti-Semitism. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are all allegations documented by the UN, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and even Israel's own courts in some cases. Yeah, so today, let's talk about everything. Of course, we have to cover just a little bit of history. So first off, we have to talk about the Haganah. And the Haganah was founded in 1920 in British Mandate Palestine in the wake of the Nebi Musa riots, when Jewish communities concluded that they needed a form of organized defense. And this quickly grew into the main underground paramilitary of the Yishuv, functioning as the arm wing of the Jewish agency. It was broader, more mainstream, and at times semi-coordinated with British authorities, which gave it legitimacy within the Jewish community. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the Haganah concentrated on defending Jewish settlements and carrying out reprisal raids, but they would expand dramatically during the 1936 and 1939 Arab Revolt, when its elite units partnered with the British and special night squads to suppress the uprising through demolitions, assassinations, and retaliatory violence that often amounted to collective punishment. During the Arab Revolt, Haganah units would carry out these harsh reprisals, including blowing up houses in Arab villages and shooting suspected militants, mostly being civilians. During World War II, the organization would openly collaborate with the Allies by training thousands of Jewish volunteers while simultaneously defying British immigration quotas by smuggling in Holocaust survivors in the clandestine Aliyah Bet operations. After 1945, the Haganah would escalate its anti-British campaign, joining forces with Irgun and Lehi in the Jewish resistance movement to sabotage railways, police stations, and bridges. Although less notorious than its rivals, the Haganah would be implicated in actions today that would be defined as war crimes, that being reprisals that targeted entire villages during the 1930s revolt and the forced expulsion of Palestinians in 1947 and 1948 during operations like Nakhshan and Dani. And the Haganah would even form the backbone of the new Israel Defense Forces. In 1931, we'd see Irgun be founded, and this was a Jewish revisionist Zionist paramilitary organization that formed in British Mandatory Palestine. It broke away from the Haganah and became the underground army of the Ze'ev Jabotinsky's revisionist movement, and their goal was to establish a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan River by force. And in 1940, we'd see the Lehi, or Stern Gang, be founded, formed by Avraham Stern. And Stern, a former Irgun commander, rejected the Irgun's truce with Britain during World War II and argued that Britain was as much as an enemy as the Nazis. Lehi's goals were to expel the British mandate through armed struggle and ensure unrestricted Jewish immigration. And in early 1941, Lehi would explicitly seek an alliance with fascist Italy and even Nazi Germany. In 1944, militant Zionist groups Lehi and Irgun would intensify their campaigns against British rule in Palestine, and on November 6, 1944, Lehi assassins would kill Lord Moyne, the British Minister of State for the Middle East, after he voiced opposition to rapid Jewish statehood. In that December, Irgun, which was led by Menachem Begin, would formally declare open revolt against Britain. This conflict would escalate further on July 22, 1946, when Irgun bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which housed the British administrative headquarters, killing around 91 people. This attack would become Irgun's most infamous operation and drew worldwide condemnation, with press labeling the group a terrorist organization. And as the UN partition vote approached in late 1947, Irgun and Lehi would both expand their campaign by bombing both British and Arab targets to hasten Britain's withdrawal. On April 9th, 1948, the two groups together would jointly attack the Arab village of Deir Yassin near Jerusalem, killing around 100 people, which was an atrocity that would inflame Arab-Jewish hostilities and contributed significantly to the mass flight of Palestinians. Then you might be thinking to yourself, I clicked on this video to hear about the IDF, not Irgun and Lehi. These are terrorist organizations, right? Well, yes. On May 14th, 1948, Israel would declare their statehood as the British mandate would end, and both Irgun and Lehi would face the new Jewish government. On May 29th, 1948, the provisional Israeli government would formally disband Lehi and inducted many of their fighters into the newly formed Israel Defense Forces. And Irgun itself would also begin to integrate into the IDF. And by September 1st, 1948, Irgun's last units would take an oath of allegiance to the IDF. Many former Irgun and Lehi figures would enter Israeli politics. Menachem began for one. The Irgun commander would found Herut and later Likud and win the 1977 election to become prime minister. And Yitzhak Shamir, the Lehi leader after 1942, would join Menachem's party and serve in the government, and he himself will become prime minister in 1983. So yeah, putting it shortly, this was a government founded by... I hope you're picking up what I'm trying to put down. It is under these groups that we'd see the Nakba, which is the Palestinian term for the 1948 upheaval, which some 750,000 Palestinian Arabs, over 80% of those living in what became Israel, were expelled or fled, and more than 500 towns, villages, and urban neighborhoods were depopulated. Many were later demolished or repopulated with Jews and renamed. Rooted in decades of Zionist immigration, land purchase, and state building under Ottoman and British rule, the crisis would climax after the UN's 1947 partition plan allocated around 55% of the land to a future Jewish state, though Arabs were about 2/3 of the population and already owned most of the land. Fighting would begin in late 1947 and escalated with Plan Dalet in April 1948 and included massacres like there you're seeing it, and urban clearances, widespread looting, and documented cases of sexual violence. And by the end of the Arab-Israeli War, Israel would hold roughly 78% of mandatory Palestine, including half of the area that was allocated to the proposed Arab state. The West Bank and Gaza would be under Jordanian and Egyptian control, and UNGA Resolution 194 endorsed refugee return and compensation, which Israel rejected. Inside Israel, some 156,000 Palestinians would remain under military rule, with tens of thousands internally displaced, and Israel would enact laws like the absentees property to expropriate land, erase Arabic culture, and reconfigure the landscape. The Palestinian experience was one of mass dispossession, denationalization, which we would see formalized by Israel's 1952 nationality law, and the creation of a vast refugee diaspora, which is now counted in millions. And many scholars across several disciplines would describe 1948 as ethnic cleansing. In the early 1950s, we'd see the IDF began conducting cross-border retaliatory raids that would, of course, draw UN condemnation for excessive force against civilians. For example, on January 6, 1952, an IDF unit raided Beit Jala, which was the West Bank under Jordanian rule, and they demolished homes with explosives and killed 7 civilians, including a mother and her 4 children. The UN Truce Supervision Organization would condemn this as a, quote, serious breach of the 1949 armistice, noting the indiscriminate nature of the attack. Nevertheless, on August 28, 1953, Ariel Sharon's Unit 101 would attack the Berej refugee camp in Gaza, throwing bombs into huts and shooting fleeing residents, and at least 20 civilians would be killed, with the UN Mixed Armistice Commission describing it as an appalling case of deliberate mass murder. Weeks later, on October 14, 1953, Ariel Sharon's Unit 101 would strike the West Bank village of Kibbutz, blowing up dozens of homes with inhabitants inside. 69 Palestinian villagers, mostly women and children, would be massacred. UN observers noted bodies at the doorways and bullet holes in doors, suggesting villagers had been trapped and gunned down before the demolition of their homes. And Ariel Sharon later claimed that he thought the houses were empty. And ironically, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion would deny IDF involvement and falsely blamed border settlers for the massacre, which is, of course, now we know, a claim that's implausible, a lie. Ariel Sharon and those involved were never prosecuted, and Kibbutz stands as one of the most infamous episodes of Israel's early reprisal doctrine, where punitive raids deliberately blurred the line between military and civilian targets. The next year, on the night of March 28, 1954, we see Israeli forces launch a deadly cross-border raid on the Jordanian village of Nahalin, striking shortly after midnight with mortars, machine guns, grenades, and incendiary bombs. This attack devastated the small community, leaving around 14 civilians dead and wounding between 10 and 18 others, including women and children. Israeli troops placed explosives that destroyed several homes, along with the village mosque, and the Jordanian National Guard and Arab Legion intervened, engaging the Israeli attackers in a firefight, and this incident would underscore the volatility of the border regions during the early years of the Arab-Israeli conflict, with heavy civilian casualties. Around 2 years later, in 1956, during the joint Israeli-British-French invasion of Egypt, or the Suez Crisis, Israeli forces would occupy Gaza and Sinai and would be accused of massacring Palestinian refugees. We'd see the Kafir Qasim massacre, which occurred on October 29th, 1956, the very day Israel launched the invasion of the Sinai Peninsula alongside Britain and France, as that evening, Israeli border police suddenly imposed a curfew on several Arab villages inside Israel's borders, including Kafir Qasim, but the order was not communicated to many villagers who were returning home from their fields, and as they arrived, unaware of the new restriction, border police opened fire, killing 49 men, women, and children. About a month later, on November 3rd, 1956, during the Suez Crisis, we'd see Israeli forces enter the town of Khan Yunis and its adjacent refugee camp in Gaza as part of their offensive against Egyptian positions. According to reports, Israeli soldiers would carry out mass executions during house-to-house searches and public roundups of men aged 15 to 60, ostensibly to root out Fedayeen guerrillas, and eyewitnesses would describe men being shot in the streets, dragged from their homes, and lined up against walls in the central square or refugee camps before being gunned down with machine guns. Survivors, including the future Hamas leader Abdel Aziz al-Rantizi, who was a child at the time, recalled his relatives being executed in cold blood, while curfews prevented families from retrieving bodies that were left in the streets. Around 9 days later, on November 12, 1956, during Israel's occupation of Gaza and the Sinai, in the wake of this crisis, we'd see the fall of Rafah, one of the two main invasion points, which would lead to the Israeli military rounding up thousands of Palestinian men, and eyewitnesses would describe civilians being forced at gunpoint to march to a local UNRWA school, where stragglers were shot on sight, survivors were beaten, and detainees were humiliated and made to sit for hours. According to survivor accounts, dozens were executed outright, with bodies later being dumped, and the UNRWA's official report confirmed 111 Palestinians were killed, that being 103 refugees, 7 residents, and 1 Egyptian. The killings, of course, mirrored the Khan Yunis massacre that we just talked about, which was part of a broader Israeli campaign of summary executions and mass detentions during their 4-month occupation that killed around 1,000 Palestinians across the Strip. Despite Israeli denials, the UN would condemn the Rafah events as mass killings, and the atrocities would be reported widely in the foreign press, which contributed to US pressure on Israel, as we would see with President Eisenhower's threat of sanctions to get Israel to withdraw from Gaza by March of 1957. Despite pressure from the US, throughout the 1960s, especially in Israel's early years, we'd see US aid aiming to help absorb hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees, that being Holocaust survivors and Jews that came from Arab lands, and to support the young democracy's shaky economy, President Truman in 1948 spoke of helping build a, quote, strong, prosperous, free Israel. We see early U.S. grants, that being a $135 million export-import bank loan in 1949, and the U.S. would largely provide economic aid, that being loans for development and agriculture and food under PL 480. Eventually, in 1962, we'd see President Kennedy approve the first major arms sale to Israel, Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, which signaled a growing alliance between the two countries, but the broader context at the time was the Cold War. America saw Israel as a potential bulwark against Soviet influence in the Middle East, but would also attempt to balance their relations with Arab oil-producing nations at the time. A few years later, in 1967, we'd see the Six-Day War in June, which was both a decisive military victory and set the backdrop for a wave of atrocities and expulsions. For those who don't remember, the Six-Day War took place in June 1967 between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, as after months of escalating tensions, including Egypt's blockade of Israeli shipping in the Red Sea and the mobilization of Arab armies, Israel launched an attack on June 5th, destroying much of Egypt's air force on the ground, and within 6 days, they had achieved a decisive victory as Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria, tripling the territory under their control. Evidence would quickly emerge of Israeli Defense Forces abuses against Egyptian soldiers and Palestinian civilians, as eyewitnesses reported Israeli soldiers executing surrendering Egyptian prisoners in the Sinai, with one retired general admitting to ordering the machine gunning of 49 unarmed Egyptian laborers horrors. We see journalists like Gabby Braun describing Egyptian POWs being forced to dig their own graves before being shot, while Israeli historian Yuri Milstein would note that although it was not official policy, there was an atmosphere that killing POWs was tolerated. Historian Tom Segev would even quote soldiers recalling orders to hunt down fleeing men and execute them on the spot. At the same time, this war would trigger a mass humanitarian crisis known as the Naksa, in which between 280,000 and 325,000 Palestinians and roughly 100,000 Syrians were displaced from the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. Entire villages were systematically destroyed as residents fled or were expelled. By December 1967, nearly 250,000 Palestinians had crossed into Jordan as thousands fled from Gaza into Egypt, and more than 100,000 left the Golan for Syria. United Nations investigators documented emptied refugee camps and large-scale demolitions. A 1971 UN Special Committee would conclude that Israel was actively pursuing policies designed to prevent return and induce further departures, with the ultimate goal of annexing and settling the occupied territories, calling it the gravest human rights violation they had observed. Even decades later, in September 1995, the New York Times will report the discovery of shallow mass graves in the Sinai, which contained the remains of 30 to 60 Egyptian prisoners who were allegedly executed by Israeli troops. Another mass grave would be uncovered at Ras Sadir in 2000, containing the remains of 52 executed prisoners, with bullet wounds found in the skull. Brigadier General Aryeh Birol would publicly admit to killing dozens of POWs, while military historian Arya Yitzhaki would estimate from official documents that around 1,000 Egyptians were executed after surrendering. Though Israeli newspapers like the Haaretz would initially cover these reports, censorship quickly intervened and no trials would ever take place. On June 8, 1967, during the Six-Day War, we'd see Israeli jets and torpedo boats launch a sustained attack on the USS Liberty, a U.S. Navy signals intelligence ship patrolling international waters near the Sinai coast. This ended up killing 34 Americans and wounding 171 others. The Liberty was clearly marked as a U.S. vessel, flying its flag and carrying large hull numbers, but Israel later claimed that they mistaken the ship for an Egyptian vessel and apologized, paying over $12 million in compensation for deaths, injuries, and damages. U.S. and Israeli inquiries would both call the attack a tragic error, citing misidentification, communication failures, and faulty speed estimates, but survivors and numerous American officials, including Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Admiral Thomas Maurer, have long argued that it was deliberate, possibly to prevent the U.S. from intercepting Israeli communications about operations in the Sinai and the Golan Heights. This is a very controversial event, as there is crew testimony that life rafts were strafed or shot at, signals were jammed, and distress calls were blocked, and disputes over whether identification actually was made and whether Israeli pilots knew the ship was American remains debated to this day. In the protracted conflict with Egypt after 1967, the IDF was accused of many unlawful attacks on civilian targets. Notably, on February 12th, 1970, Israeli aircraft would bomb a civilian metal factory at Abu Zabal, Egypt, which killed 70 to 80 workers. The attack involved the use of rockets, delayed action bombs, and napalm, which also left 69 other people injured. According to Israel, they claimed that the factory was being used for military purposes. However, Egypt maintained that it was a civilian industrial site. 2 months later, on April 8, 1970, the Israeli Air Force would strike an Egyptian elementary school, Bahr al-Bakar, killing 46 children and wounding dozens. These bombings of non-military sites would prompt international condemnation, as many viewed them as deliberate or reckless attacks on civilians, which violated the Geneva Conventions. However, Israel claimed that it mistook the school for a military installation, which is, a very common theme we would see even to this day. Throughout the 60s and 70s, Israel's, quote, stunning victory over Soviet-backed armies greatly impressed U.S. officials, as suddenly Israel proved its value as a pro-Western powerhouse in a region where Soviet influence was rising. At the time, the U.S. was involved in Vietnam and unable to intervene in the Middle East. And from 1967 onward, U.S. policy shifted to build up Israel as a stabilizing ally. Aid levels would skyrocket after 1973, and from a Cold War point of view, Israel was now firmly America's carrier in the region, countering Soviet-armed Syria, Egypt, and Iraq. Moreover, U.S. leaders saw strengthening Israel as a way to deter all-out war in the Middle East.
Listen. Every day, the incessant sounds of war. And yet, every day in Israel, the incredible spirit of her people reaffirms a faith in the goodness of life. Help them to achieve that life. We hear you, Israel.
Throughout the 60s and 70s, we'd also see Israeli Secret Service operations abroad that have drawn accusations of illegal state violence, as in 1960, Mossad agents would kidnap Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann from Argentina and smuggled him to Israel for trial. While Eichmann's crimes were monstrous, Israel's abduction actually violated Argentine sovereignty, leading to the UN Security Council to actually reprimand Israel for this. Nevertheless, during Operation Wrath of God in the 1970s, which was Israel's retaliation for the Munich Olympic massacre, Mossad would conduct assassinations across Europe and the Midwest. However, in one bungled operation in Norway, agents mistakenly killed an innocent Moroccan waiter, thinking he was a PLO figure. This event has often been cited as an example of Mossad operating with disregard for other nations' sovereignty, and Israel would pay compensation to the waiter's family. Wow. In 1971, we'd see Koch be founded, and Rabbi Meir Kahane, an American-born Orthodox rabbi, would establish this Koch party in Israel, and Koch would be an explicitly ultra-nationalist anti-Arab party. Its platform would call for the expulsion of Arabs from Israel, imposing Jewish law, and annexing the entire land of Israel. And in their early years, they would contest elections, but repeatedly fail to pass the threshold, as Kahane's fiery rhetoric, including calls to revoke Arab citizenship, would make their persona a little too extreme. But remember this party. Remember it. You're going to need it later. In 1973, we'd see the Yom Kippur War, also known as the October War, which broke out on October 1st, 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israel during Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism. The Egyptian army would cross the Suez Canal, while Syrian forces advanced into the Golan Heights, initially overwhelming Israeli defenses. In the first days, Arab forces gained ground and inflicted heavy losses, but Israel quickly mobilized reserves and counterattacked. And by October 10th, Israeli troops had pushed Syrian forces back beyond the pre-war ceasefire lines, and in the south, after a costly battle, Israel crossed the Suez Canal into Egypt, encircling the Egyptian Third Army, and the war would end with a UN-brokered ceasefire on October 25th. And this would directly lead to US-brokered peace efforts and set the stage for the 1978 Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. Beginning in 1978, we'd see Israel's military interventions in Lebanon leading to high civilian casualties and war crimes. During the 1982 Lebanon War, the IDF's protracted siege of Beirut involved intensive bombardment of dense civilian districts, which caused thousands of casualties. These actions were widely criticized as indiscriminate. The most infamous incident was the Sabra and Shatila massacre on September 16, 1982, as after Israel's forces encircled Beirut's Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, their Lebanese Falangist allies entered and slaughtered Palestinians in over 40 hours. Estimates of the dead range into the thousands, including many women and children. An Israeli Commission of Inquiry later found the IDF indirectly responsible for failing to prevent the massacre, and Defense Minister Ariel Sharon was found personally responsible for neglecting to stop the killings. The commission deemed it a gross violation of humanitarian norms, and as a result, Sharon was forced to resign as defense minister, though he faced no criminal charges. Separately, during 1982, the IDF would also be accused of indiscriminate shelling and use of phosphorus bombs in Lebanese villages and of cluster bomb use in civilian areas, in violation of the prohibition on weapons that caused unnecessary suffering. Now, by the 1980s, the U.S.-Israel strategic alliance would deepen, especially in the Reagan years. And in 1981, Israel was designated a, quote, major non-NATO ally. Military aid would be institutionalized at high levels, roughly between $1.8 billion annually by the mid-80s, plus economic aid of $1.2 billion. Joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and weapons co-development, like the Arrow missile program, began in 1986 with U.S. funding, and these all grew over time. However, Israel would end up facing an economic crisis in 1984 with hyperinflation greater than 400%. The U.S. would step in with a $1.5 billion emergency economic aid program in 1985 and stabilize Israel's economy. U.S. policymakers at the time believed a collapsing Israeli economy would imperil a, quote, key ally, and Israel would recover. And after this, Israel's economy improved, and it voluntarily agreed to gradually reduce U.S. economic aid, cutting $120 million a year from 1987 onwards, with the aim of phasing out economic grants by the late 90s. Military aid would, however, continue at full levels, even often increasing. And by the decade's end, the US was also funding new programs like the Lavi fighter jet and giving Israel access to cutting-edge gear like F-15s and F-16s. In 1984, we'd see the Solmar massacre, which took place on September 20th when Druze members of the Israeli-backed South Lebanon Army, or SLA, opened fire on a group of Shia civilians in the Lebanese village of Solmar, killing 13 and wounding 20 to 40 others. The SLA, led by Antoine Lahad and trained and armed by Israel, had gathered around 300 men, aged 16 to 39, in the village square after a recent ambush that killed several Druze militiamen. And encircled by Israeli defense forces, the SLA began shooting and throwing grenades at villagers, while shouting that the killings were revenge for the ambush. The attack lasted 15 to 30 minutes, and Lebanese Information Minister Joseph Skaf condemned the massacre as part of a broader pattern of Israel-supported atrocities, while Israeli officials deflected blame onto the SLA. In 1987, we'd see the first Intifada beginning in December of that year, which was a largely unarmed Palestinian uprising against occupation, especially in the West Bank and Gaza, which was met by brutal Israeli crackdown. While protesters often used stones, slingshots, or makeshift barricades, the Israeli Defense Forces and Border Police frequently responded with live ammunition, mass beatings, and widespread arrests. Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin even infamously ordered troops to, quote, break the bones of demonstrators, effectively sanctioning extrajudicial violence. Over the course of the Intifada, more than 1,000 Palestinians, many of them being children, were killed, while countless others were injured or detained, and the period also exposed systemic torture of Palestinian prisoners by Israel's Shin Bet in direct violation of the Convention Against Torture. One notorious case would come in February 1988 when 2 Palestinian workers were beaten to death by Israeli soldiers in Gaza, and the case would become emblematic of state-backed brutality. Tensions would peak with several notorious incidents of excessive force, as on April 13, 1989, Israeli border police staged a pre-dawn raid on the West Bank village of Nahalin during Ramadan, aimed at suppressing nationalist displays like flags and graffiti. However, when local youths threw stones, the troops would impose a sweeping curfew and open fire with live rounds, killing 5 Palestinian youths and injuring more than 50. Then, on October 10, 1990, amidst heightened tensions over the Sukkot March in Jerusalem, Israeli border police opened fire with automatic weapons on Palestinian protesters at the Temple Mount, killing at least 21 and wounding more than 150. And together, these events would highlight the pattern of indiscriminate and punitive force that defined Israel's response to the uprising, of which in reality was just people rebelling against occupation. Of course, we'd see more of this down the line. Throughout the 80s, we'd also see high-profile covert operations continue from Mossad, as on April 16, 1988, Israeli commandos assassinated Khalil al-Wazir, a PLO leader, at his home in Tunis. And while Israel saw him as a legitimate target, the raid actually violated Tunisian sovereignty and ended up killing bystanders, which provoked UN Security Council denunciation of Israel, or Resolution 611. And Israel would even abduct Mordecai Vanunu, an Israeli whistleblower, in Rome in 1986, luring him and later drugging him and shipping him to Israel, which completely breached Italian sovereignty and has been condemned as a kidnapping. Beginning in the 90s, with the Soviet Union gone, U.S. aid to Israel did not diminish, and it was instead refocused, as in 1991, after the Gulf War, President George H.W. Bush secured $10 billion in U.S. loan guarantees to help Israel absorb a mass influx of Soviet Jewish immigrants. We'd also see the early 90s peace process, that being the Oslo Accords, which saw the U.S. reward cooperation as Congress maintained Israel's $3 billion in annual aid, while also starting aid to the new Palestinian Authority. Military aid would be boosted from $1.8 billion to $2.4 billion by 1998, and domestically, support for Israel would remain a bipartisan constant, meaning this was something you could expect from both Democrats and Republicans in the US, and this was all influenced by a strong pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC. Also, evangelical Christian support and public sympathy for the Middle East lone democracy. Peace in the Middle East. Go planet.
For more than 40 years, the United States has been Israel's closest friend in the world, and this remains the case and will as long as I am President of the United States. This is a friendship backed up with real support.
And President Clinton and I are proud, as are all Americans, that the United States was the first nation to recognize the State of Israel. 11 minutes after you proclaimed your independence on the 5th of ER, 50 years ago.
He saw land built out of centuries. He saw a wall connected to heaven. He saw people his age who were 2,000 years old. He saw ancient civilizations spring to life each day. But what I saw was that it was not my son's eyes experiencing Israel. It was his heart. Israel, no one belongs here more than you.
In 1993, we'd see Operation Accountability, known in Lebanon as the Seven-Day War, which began on July 25th, when Israel launched a week-long campaign against southern Lebanon. The stated goals were threefold. 1, to strike Hezbollah directly. 2, to prevent southern Lebanon from being used as a base for attacks into Israel. And 3, most controversially, to displace hundreds of thousands of civilians so that the Lebanese government would be pressured into curbing Hezbollah. The operation unfolded against the backdrop of the Lebanese civil war's end and the Taif Agreement, which had disbanded militias but explicitly exempted Hezbollah as a resistance movement against Israeli occupation. After clashes, including Israeli airstrikes and Hezbollah rocket fire, Israel escalated with heavy bombardments. The IDF fired over 25,000 artillery shells, dropped 1,000-pound bombs, while Hezbollah launched around 150 Katyusha rockets into northern Israel. In the process, between 300,000 and 400,000 Lebanese civilians were displaced, with around 55 villages being heavily damaged and over 100 civilians being killed. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International later accused both sides of violating the laws of war, Israel for indiscriminate bombardment and targeting civilian infrastructure, and of course Hezbollah for firing rockets into Israeli towns. The violence would eventually end with a U.S. brokered oral ceasefire in which Israel agreed not to target civilians if Hezbollah refrained from striking Israeli civilian areas. And although the ceasefire held for a brief state, this would set the stage for the more devastating Operation Grapes of Wrath we'd see in a couple of years. In 1994, on April 25th, we'd see US-born Koch supporter Baruch Goldstein murder 29 Muslim worshippers at Hebron's Cave of the Patriarchs. It was, we've talked about this in the mass shooting video, but this atrocity would trigger swift action, as in March of 1994, Israel's cabinet would outlaw the Koch Party and Kahan under anti-terrorism laws. Ironic. In Canada, Japan, the European Union, and the United States would all list Koch as a terrorist organization. But if you ask me, Baruch Goldstein literally fits the criteria of being the Prime Minister of Israel. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. In 1996, we see Operation Grapes of Wrath, which was a 17-day Israeli military campaign on April 1996, targeting Hezbollah rocket attacks from southern Lebanon into Israel. This was sparked after Hezbollah rocket fire wounded several Israeli civilians, and Israel would launch over 600 air raids and fired over 25,000 shells, deliberately striking Shiite villages with the stated aim of forcing mass civilian flight to pressure Lebanon and Syria to rein in Hezbollah. Around 250 Lebanese civilians will be killed, including more than 100 who died when Israeli artillery shelled a UN compound in Qana, where civilians were seeking shelter. Human Rights Watch estimated over 400,000 Lebanese civilians were displaced, while Israeli shelling and air raids devastated bridges, power plants, ambulances, and homes, inflicting over $500 million in damages. International outrage over the Qana killings drove U.S. brokered negotiations that produced a ceasefire on April 27, 1996, and this prohibited both sides from targeting civilians or using civilian areas for attacks. Now, within Operation Grapes of Wrath, we'd see the Mansouri attack, which took place on April 13th, 1996, when an Israeli Apache helicopter targeted a Volvo vehicle marked as an ambulance in the village of Mansouri, southern Lebanon. The driver was a farmer and volunteer ambulance worker and was transporting wounded villagers and his 4 children when the helicopter fired 2 missiles into the vehicle. Of the 13 passengers fleeing the violence, 6 civilians were killed, including 2 women and 4 children. And while Israeli officials admitted the strike was deliberate, Major General Moshe Yalan claimed that militants were using the vehicle to escape. However, subsequent investigations found no evidence linking any of the victims to Hezbollah. We'd also see the Nabatea Falka attack on April 16th, 1996, when Israeli helicopters bombed a two-story home in the village of Nabatea Falka, killing 9 members of a family, 7 of them being children, including a 4-day-old infant. The IDF justified the strike as a retaliation for Hezbollah attack, but Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch found no evidence of militants in the building, concluding that it was a civilian home. And Prime Minister Shimon Peres would blame the victims for not leaving their homes earlier while Israel was bombing them. Yeah, man. Beginning in the 2000s, we'd see the 9/11 attacks in 2001 and the global war on terror, which further solidified U.S.-Israel ties. American public opinion would view Israel as a fellow target of Islamist radical terrorism, and Congress increased support accordingly. During the Second Intifada, beginning in 2000, President Bush and Congress provided supplemental aid, that being hundreds of millions for Israel's new anti-terror fence and for improved homeland defense. A second 10-year MOU in 2007 under President George W. Bush would set military aid at $30 billion from 2009 to 2018, which was $3 billion per year. And one goal was to upgrade Israel's capabilities with F-35 jets, missile defenses, and to keep its, quote, qualitative military edge over potential adversaries. And this concept had Cold War origins, but gained new emphasis amidst the massive U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia and Gulf states. Essentially, whenever the U.S. sold advanced weapons to Arab partners, it often boosted Israel's aid or access to even more advanced technology to maintain balance. Another driver in the 2000s was Iran's growing threat. Israel and pro-Israel U.S. lawmakers argued that strengthening Israel's military, like funding the Arrow 2 and Iron Dome missile defense, also protected U.S. interests by deterring Iran and its proxies. And throughout this period, U.S. aid was rarely questioned. After all, Israel helped test U.S. weaponry in real combat and shared valuable intel, like on Syria's reactor in 2007. And politically, President Bush in 2008 called Israel a vital ally in the global war on terror. In 2000, we'd see the Second Intifada begin, which was marked by escalating violence between Palestinian militants and the Israeli military, with some of the most notorious incidents unfolding in 2002. In April of 2002, Israel would launch Operation Defensive Shield, which was a large-scale reinvasion of the West Bank cities, including Jenin. We'd see the Battle of Jenin beginning on April 1st, in which Palestinian officials initially accused Israel of committing a massacre, and the UN and human rights organizations would confirm at least 52 Palestinians killed, more than half of them being civilians. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International reported that many of the deaths involved unlawful or deliberate killings, and some amounted to war crimes. And these included the use of civilians as human shields, execution of detainees, bulldozing houses with residents still inside, and even crushing a paralyzed man to death. The IDF also used heavy shelling and bulldozers to raze large sections of refugee camps, which was acts described as disproportionate and indiscriminate under international humanitarian law. And journalists and rights groups on the ground documented widespread destruction. Hundreds of homes were flattened, medical care was denied, ambulances were blocked, and entire families were wiped out in explosions or demolitions. The Observer's Peter Beaumont would go on to write that while the Battle of Jenin was not technically a massacre, the deliberate leveling of homes and infrastructure constituted a war crime under the Geneva Convention's prohibition of extensive destruction, and was not justified by military necessity. Not only this, but would also see the Mohammed al-Dura incident on September 30th, 2000, which became one of the most iconic and controversial moments of the Second Intifada. The footage showed 12-year-old Mohammed and his father Jamal trapped behind a concrete barrier in Gaza under heavy gunfire, which culminated in the boy being killed. These images would spark global outrage, with Muhammad held as a martyr across the Arab and Muslim world. At the same time, the footage would spread internationally. During the Second Intifada, Israel would also extend its campaign of, quote, targeted killings in Gaza, which further blurred the line between military action and collective punishment. In July 2002, the IDF would drop a 1-ton bomb on a residential block in Gaza City to kill Hamas commander Salah Shahed, and while Shahed was killed, so were 15 civilians. including 9 children. An entire neighborhood was flattened. Even some Israeli officials called the strike excessive, while international observers condemned it as a war crime for its disproportionate civilian toll. Nevertheless, we'd still see this pattern repeat over the years. A few years later, between June 29th and August 5th of 2004, the Israeli Defense Forces would mount a 37-day raid and siege on Beth Hanun in the northern Gaza Strip, codenamed Operation Forward Shield. Its aim was to prevent further rockets into Israel after 2 people were killed on June 28th, and the operation began with helicopter strikes that hit offices used by local and international media, including BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, ARD, and Al Jil. While the IDF would claim that the building was a Hamas communication center distributing incitement and maintaining contact with militants, Human Rights Watch and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights and the Committee to Protect Journalists characterized the attack as a move to silence Palestinian media. By 5 a.m. on June 29th, tanks and helicopters had circled Beth Hanun, imposing a total ban on civilian movement in and out of the town. And on August 3rd, the operation expanded westward, with additional armor and redeployment beginning on August 5th. In over 37 days, 19 to 20 Palestinians were killed, including 6 children, and the assault caused extensive destruction. PCHR would report 70 homes being demolished, with widespread damage to schools, clinics, kindergartens, mosques, workshops, sewage pumps, security posts, and core infrastructure. That being water, electricity, sewage, and roads. A central component was a systematic leveling of agricultural land by bulldozers and tanks, and orchards were almost completely razed. Rights groups would allege international humanitarian law violations, that being the destruction of civilian property, obstruction of medical assistance, firing on ambulances and medical personnel, and occupation of residents' homes. And this whole town-wide siege was seen as an unlawful collective punishment in breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention, not to mention their attacks on the press. A few years later, in the 34-day conflict with Hezbollah in 2006, Israeli forces would be accused of international humanitarian law breaches, as during this time, the IDF would conduct massive air and artillery strikes across Lebanon that killed approximately 1,100 Lebanese, majority being civilians. Particularly egregious was the Qana airstrike on July 30th, 2006, when Israeli bombs hit a building sheltering civilians in the village of Qana, killing 28 people, 16 of them being children. This was the second such tragedy that occurred in this village, the first being the one in 1996, which we talked about, and a UN investigation suggested Israel's explanation of a, quote, Hezbollah rocket site nearby did not justify the strike's timing. An international outrage grew over Israel's widespread use of cluster munitions in civilian areas during the war's final days, as up to 4 million cluster bomblets were fired, saturating villages with deadly submunitions that would later wound civilians. The UN Secretary General and human rights organizations condemned this as a, quote, extensive and indiscriminate use of cluster bombs, violating the prohibition on indiscriminate attacks. And the post-war UN inquiry, or Winograd Commission, would acknowledge Israeli operational failings, but did not pursue legal accountability. Beginning in 2006 in the Gaza-Israel conflict, we'd see Operation Summer Rains, which was a summer-long series of IDF ground incursions, airstrikes, artillery barrages, and naval closures across the Gaza Strip that began after Palestinian militants tunneled into Israel on June 25th, 2006, killed 2 soldiers, and captured Gilad Shalit. Israel stated that this operation was to halt Qassam rocket fire on the western Negev and secure Shalit's release, and hostilities would escalate on June 28th, with the first major IDF ground operation in Gaza since the 2005 pullout, including bridge demolitions at Split Gaza, seizure of Gaza's airport, and an airstrike that disabled the enclave's only power plant, causing widespread power outages and, of course, a humanitarian crisis. Israel struck government offices, including the Interior Ministry and the Prime Minister's office, raided suspected militant sites, and dropped leaflets urging the evacuation of, quote, launch areas, and reoccupied positions near former settlements. While Israeli raids and targeted killings triggered deadly incidents, including the June 9th Gaza beach blast that killed 8 family members, which Israel denied responsibility for, Israel would nevertheless arrest scores of Hamas officials in the West Bank, and the campaign would shift into Operation Autumn Clouds on November 1st, with a large Beit Hanun assault and a November 8th IDF shelling of residential houses that killed at least 19 civilians and wounded 40. A tenuous ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal on November 26 ended autumn clouds, and humanitarian impacts were severe as there were border closures, fuel and water crises, raw sewage discharges, hospital generator shortages, and warnings from UN officials of imminent system collapse. The IDF would be accused of using civilians as human shields, and Amnesty International called deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure collective punishment and a war crime. By this point in November, 416 Palestinians would be counted killed since June 28th, and Israel will report 5 soldiers and 6 civilians killed. Beginning in the 2010s, we'd see U.S. aid reach new heights, mainly due to missile defense cooperation and long-term agreements, as the rise of radical Islamist militias like ISIS and Iran's regional influence kept Israel at the center of U.S. Middle East strategy. Under President Obama, disagreements would emerge, notably over Iran's nuclear deal and Israeli settlements, but military aid was not only sustained, it grew. The Obama administration signed a landmark $38 billion MOU for 2019 to 2028, the largest U.S. aid pledge ever. It guarantees Israel $3.3 billion per year, plus $500 million per year for missile defense. Obama stated that this would, quote, ensure Israel could defend itself by itself in a dangerous neighborhood. The rationale included countering sophisticated threats like Hezbollah's rocket arsenal and maintaining Israel's edge as neighboring Arab states acquired U.S. arms. By now, U.S. aid was almost purely military. Some Democrats raised concerns about human rights, like civilian casualties in Gaza, but in practice, aid levels didn't drop. We see the Abraham Accords in 2020, where Israel normalized relations with several Arab states and did not reduce U.S. aid to Israel, and if anything, the U.S. incentivized the deals by offering F-35s to the United Arab Emirates, while doubling down on assurances of Israel's aid. As Joe Biden said, his longtime stance epitomizes the U.S.'s view of Israel, saying, quote, if there were no Israel, we'd have to invent one. Basically calling support for Israel a strategic imperative for America. Beginning in Gaza around 2008, we'd see repeated conflicts in the region have widespread allegations of war crimes against both Israel and Palestinian armed groups. An Operation Cast led beginning in December 27th, 2008 and lasting until January 18th, 2009. Israel's offensive in Gaza following Hamas rocket fire saw around 1,400 Palestinians being killed, including over 900 civilians, while 13 Israelis died. A UN fact-finding mission led by Justice Richard Goldstone found, quote, strong evidence that Israel committed war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity. We see the Goldstone report in September 2009 concluding that Israel's military deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure in Gaza as a form of collective punishment. For example, destroying homes, factories, water wells, and Gaza's only flour mill without military necessity. The Goldstone report also condemned Israel's use of heavy artillery and white phosphorus in densely populated areas. Human Rights Watch would document multiple instances of Israel firing white phosphorus munitions over Gaza City, burning civilians, and Amnesty International investigators on the ground called Israel's phosphorus use, quote, indiscriminate and illegal, declaring its repeated use in densely populated areas, despite its toll on civilians, a war crime. In one incident on January 15, 2009, Israeli shells set the main UNRWA humanitarian compound on fire with phosphorus, and it also struck the Al-Quds hospital, forcing an evacuation. These actions would draw global condemnation as UN officials described them as wanton and clearly in violation of international human rights laws. Not to mention the Gaza Strip has been under Israeli blockade since 2007, a siege that UN experts say inflicts disproportionate damage on civilians and amounts to unlawful collective punishment. In May of 2010, Israel's Navy raided the Mavi Marmara aid flotilla flotilla en route to Gaza and killed 9 activists. This isn't the only flotilla raid that they've made. I'm pretty sure they've kidnapped Greta Thunberg like 20 times by now. In July to August 2014, we'd see Israel wage a massive air and ground offensive in Gaza, that being called Operation Protective Edge, and over 2,100 Palestinians would be killed, roughly 3/4 of them being civilians and hundreds of them being children, and entire neighborhoods would be flattened. A UN commission would, quote, found credible allegations of war crimes by both Israel and Palestinian militants, and Human Rights Watch documented numerous Israeli strikes on clearly civilian buildings, homes, markets, and schools, with no evident military target, calling these unlawful airstrikes that killed civilians a violation of the laws of war. For example, in late July, Israeli shells hit UN-run schools being used as shelters, despite their coordinates being known to Israel, which killed at least 44 displaced people. We see an incident on August 1st, known as Black Friday, when Israel unleashed heavy artillery and tank fire in Rafah after a soldier's capture. This attack was widely disproportionate and indiscriminate, as it killed at least 135 civilians. Throughout the conflict, Israel would bombard Gaza's civilian infrastructure, homes, hospitals, mosques, power and water facilities, far beyond any necessity, leading groups to accuse it of collective punishment and unlawful death from above. Beginning in 2018, we see the Great March of Return demonstrations draw unarmed Gazans to the perimeter fence as Israeli snipers repeatedly opened fire on protesters, many of whom posed no imminent threat. By the year's end, over 180 Palestinians were killed and thousands wounded, with many being shot in the legs or back while fleeing, including children, journalists, and medics. A UN Human Rights Council inquiry reported Israeli soldiers knowingly shot at civilians, journalists, health workers, and children who were clearly identifiable as such. In May of 2021, fighting between Israel and Gaza armed groups would devastate civilian areas, as according to UN figures, Israeli strikes killed around 260 Palestinians, of whom at least 129 were civilians, including 60 children. There'd be multiple cases where entire Gaza families were wiped out in their homes by Israeli missiles and bombs, being attacks with no credible military target nearby. And since October 2023, following Hamas's assault on Israel, Israeli forces have subjugated Gaza to a punishing bombing campaign and full siege. Today, thousands of Palestinian civilians have been killed, around 70% being children and women, and critical infrastructure has been destroyed. I mean, if you look at footage, Gaza is a complete wasteland. Like, the land is decimated. UN and rights monitors report clear evidence that Israel has committed widespread war crimes, and Israeli officials openly announced the intent to cut off Gaza's electricity, fuel, food, and water, which is a war crime. We'd also see the Flower Massacre occur on February 29th, 2024 in Gaza, when crowds of starving Palestinians converged on an aid convoy organized with Israeli security. At least 100 people would be killed and around 700 will be wounded as Israeli forces opened fire amidst the scramble for flour and food, leaving victims drenched in flour and blood in what became known as the deadliest mass casualty event in Gaza since Israel's ground invasion. Israel said troops fired warning shots and then, quote, at suspects, claiming fewer than 10 deaths were from IDF fire and the rest were from stampedes and trucks fleeing the chaos. Survivors and medics, however, would describe an ambush in which tanks, drones, and snipers shot into the crowd, and trucks ran people over, and hospital officials would report treating large numbers of gunshot wounds, which was corroborated by UN staff. This massacre unfolded against extreme hunger after tightened blockade conditions, and this would be labeled a genocide-era crime. However, Israeli hardliners praised the troops' actions, despite the killings fitting a pattern of using unlawful force against civilians. On April 1st, 2024, we'd see Israeli drones strike a clearly marked, pre-coordinated 3-vehicle World Kitchen convoy in Gaza, firing 3 missiles over 5 minutes and killing 7 aid workers, that being Australian, British, Palestinian, Polish, and a dual American-Canadian, who were escorting food from a temporary pier to a northern warehouse amidst famine conditions. As we've seen throughout these conflicts, Israel has repeatedly blasted targets deep inside civilian areas, at times targeting civilians themselves, including refugee camps and UN schools, resulting in civilian death tolls far exceeding military gains. The UN and NGOs have even called for war crimes investigations, and for context, Hamas and allied groups have also committed crimes, launching rockets at Israeli towns and executing alleged collaborators, but in Gaza, the overwhelming destruction and civilian toll from Israeli firepower has one word for it, disproportionate. Now, we'd see famine grip Gaza, especially today, as since May 27, 2025, after an 11-week Israeli near-total aid blockade in early March, lethal crowd shootings have occurred around the new U.S. and Israel Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF, distribution hubs, which the UN and major NGOs say corral civilians into overcrowded, militarized zones. By July 31st, it would be documented that at least 1,300 Palestinians were killed while seeking food, with Gaza authorities and hospitals tallying higher counts through August and September as incidents continued. By mid-August, local counts cited more than 1,800 dead and 13,000 wounded at or near GHF sites and UN convoy routes. Witnesses, medics, and aid groups repeatedly report Israeli tanks, drones, helicopters, and soldiers firing on the crowds, often described by survivors as death traps. And while the IDF typically denies firing within or near the centers, they frame their shots as, quote, warning fire at, quote, suspects, or blame chaos and looting. Contractors and GHF workers told reporters that they saw live fire, stun grenades, and pepper spray used on famished civilians. And to this day, civilians are gunned down in these episodes, as we'd see coordinated airdrops that repeatedly fall in Israeli designated military zones, which have been called death traps. Hind Rajab was a 5-year-old Palestinian girl who was killed on January 29th, 2024 during Israel's invasion of the Gaza Strip when her family's car came under tank fire in Gaza City, killing 6 of her relatives and leaving her trapped in the vehicle alongside her cousin, who called the Palestinian Red Crescent Society for help before being shot and killed while still on the line. Hind Rajab survived, injured, and stayed on the phone for hours begging for rescuers to come, but when a PRCS ambulance was eventually dispatched, it too was shot at and destroyed, killing 2 paramedics. Hind Rajab's fate was unknown until her family discovered her body in the car after Israeli forces withdrew, alongside the wrecked ambulance nearby. Israel would deny its forces were in the area, yet investigations by the Washington Post, Sky News, and Forensic Architecture used satellite imagery, visual evidence, and shell fragments to conclude that Israeli tanks were indeed present, one firing hundreds of rounds at the family car and likely destroying the ambulance, in attacks that UN experts later say amounted to war crimes. Her death sparked international outrage. Yeah, a total of 335 rounds were fired at the car that Hind Rajab and her family were in. Yeah. These conflicts have also become the deadliest for journalists in recorded history, with UN figures in August of 2025 putting Palestinian journalists killed by Israel at 242, with the Committee to Protect Journalists counting 192, the International Federation of Journalists counting at least 180, and an independent aggregation tallying 274, with reporters being shot, burned alive from bombings, and families also being targeted. Survivors describe constant danger, that being drones, shootings, arson, and smear campaigns tying them to Hamas, and Israel has even admitted striking journalists it claimed were militants. And these conflicts would echo earlier emblematic cases such as the 2022 killing of Shireen Abu Akleh in Jenin, which multiple investigations linked to Israeli fire despite official denials. With casualty counts rising month after month, and Israel barring most foreign media from Gaza, Palestinian reporters carried nearly all frontline coverage, and international press freedom organizations and more than 30 newsrooms called the killings not just the deadliest, but also the most deliberate effort to silence the press. During the Gaza war, we'd also see extensive evidence from UN bodies, human rights groups, and media investigations documenting systematic sexual violence and humiliation by IDF forces against Palestinian civilians and detainees, including executions of women and children, waving white flags, denial of basic needs, rape, stripping, beatings, and degrading photographs posted online. UN reporters in February 2024 confirmed rapes of female detainees and widespread sexual assault during strip searches, while men and boys have also been subjected to rape with objects, invasive searches, and torture that sometimes resulted in death. Hospitals would also report injuries consistent with sexual abuse. Videos verified by Euromed Human Rights Monitor and others have showed Palestinians bound, stripped, mocked, and trampled, while soldiers have also filmed themselves rifling through women's underwear drawers and posting the footage online. A leaked video from a detention camp in July 2025 showed what appeared to be a gang rape of a Palestinian prisoner by Israeli soldiers, which would intensify international outrage and prompted calls for accountability. Parallel to these accounts, survivors have testified to humiliation, threats of rape, and invasive searches at hospitals, checkpoints, and detention facilities. And although Israel rejects most of these findings as biased or unfounded, US and EU officials publicly express concern, calling for full investigations and stressing zero tolerance for sexual abuses or whatever. In Syria, beginning in 2024, amidst the collapse of the Assad regime, Israel escalated its military operations across Syrian territory. Over the span of weeks, the Israeli Defense Forces conducted more than 350 airstrikes, targeting military infrastructure, weapons depots, radar and missile systems, and naval facilities across the region. Simultaneously, Israeli forces advanced a ground presence of up to 25 kilometers into southern Syria, apparently to establish a buffer zone, and Israel characterized the operation as defensive, but UN Secretary General and international legal observers denounced the incursion as a breach of Syrian sovereignty and a violation of existing engagements, including the 1974 disengagement agreement between Syria and Israel. By mid-2025, the conflict widened into direct confrontation with Iran, as on June 13, 2025, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, striking more than 100 targets in Iranian cities, aimed at degrading Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities. While Israel reported casualties in the low hundreds, subsequent assessments suggested the toll rose above 1,000, including civilians, and significant damage to energy grids, residences, and medical infrastructure. Israel justified the strikes as a form of anticipatory self-defense to prevent Iran from launching nuclear or missile attacks, but international law scholars and organizations called the campaign a grave violation of the prohibition on the use of force. All right, let's talk about the big G word, genocide. Now, officially, the International Criminal Court has become the central node in the legal accountability front for the Israel-Palestine conflict. And on November 21st, 2024, the ICC would issue arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, as the chamber found reasonable grounds to believe that between October 8th, 2023 and May 20th, 2024, the two officials would bear criminal responsibility as co-perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, persecution, and other inhumane acts and intentional attacks on the civilian population. In addition to these war crimes and crimes against humanity, questions of genocide have also entered the public and legal discourse, as organizations such as Amnesty International have publicly concluded that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. And meanwhile, South Africa has filed a case against the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention against Israel over its conduct in Gaza. While the ICJ is a state-to-state court, it's still examining whether Israel has breached its obligations to prevent and punish genocide, and more than 50 countries have expressed support for South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's all I want to talk about for this video. I encourage y'all to leave comments about what I missed out. I want to thank you for watching. I hope you're doing well. And yeah, man. I love you, bro.